If you take a raw, unglazed clay jar, drop a copper tube and a rusted iron rod inside and fill it to the brim with sour, fermenting grape juice, you don't just get a mess. You get a measurable 1.5 volts of electrical pressure. That is the exact same voltage as the alkaline battery sitting inside your television remote right now. Except this specific chemical reaction wasn't engineered in a modern lab. It was sitting in the dirt near Baghdad over 2,000 years ago. Actually, let me correct that. I know the title of this video says 4,000, but if we're looking at the actual archaeological dating, it is right around 2,100 years old. But the exact age really isn't the point. The point is that the $9 trillion global energy syndicate we are all completely chained to isn't relying on some futuristic, incomprehensible magic. They're just monetizing basic ancient thermodynamics and charging you a massive premium just to participate in modern society. Hi, this is Paul Chang. And if you're as sick and tired as I am of opening your utility bill every single month just to see another fabricated delivery fee from a monopoly that gatekeeps the grid, you need to hit subscribe right now. Because today, we're pulling apart the Baghdad Battery to expose exactly how the modern power industry keeps you in the dark, and I'm going to show you how this buried loophole actually works right here on my workbench.
Look at this copper tube I have right here. It is literally just scrap plumbing I pulled out of a renovation job. But when you pair it with a piece of iron, I'm using a heavy galvanized nail that I had to manually strip the zinc coating off of. But back then they just used crude forged iron rods, and you introduce a simple acidic liquid. Something genuinely incredible happens. The acid, and in this case I'm pouring in raw unpasteurized apple cider vinegar because it has the right acidity level, it immediately starts attacking the iron. It's an oxidation process, and you can actually smell it the second it starts reacting. If you lean over the jar, you get this sharp, metallic, almost sour copper smell that stings the very back of your throat just a little bit. As the iron breaks down in the acid, it loses electrons. Those electrons are desperate to go somewhere to find balance, and the copper tube is sitting right there in the same bath, practically pulling them across the liquid. That flow of invisible electrons moving from the iron to the copper, that's electricity. That's literally all it is. But here's the thing that the massive battery conglomerates, the Duracells and the Energizers and the monolithic power companies of the world, what they absolutely do not want you thinking about. They've spent billions of marketing dollars over the last century to condition you to believe that electricity is this magical, highly volatile, incredibly complex force that can only be safely manufactured in a secure, billion-dollar facility and then sold back to you in tiny plastic blister packs for $20 a pop. I mean, just think of the sheer arrogance of the markup. You're paying a massive premium for a pinch of zinc, some manganese dioxide, and a cheap steel can. The profit margins are bordering on criminal. Actually, wait, let me step back for a second because it's far worse than just the retail markup at the hardware store. It's the psychological dependency that they've engineered into us. We are completely conditioned to panic the second the grid goes down or our devices flash that red low battery icon, completely forgetting that the very ground we walk on is packed with the raw materials required to generate a current. They didn't invent this chemistry, they just bottled it up, slapped a shiny copper-colored top on it, and convinced your grandparents and your parents that you couldn't survive a power outage without their proprietary chemical blend. I used to buy into it completely, honestly. I was the guy stockpiling expensive lithium packs for my emergency survival kits, dropping hundreds of dollars a year just rotating out dead batteries that were engineered to fail. Because that is the other side of this Goliath. Planned obsolescence is the absolute bedrock of the modern energy sector. But when you look at the raw mechanics of the Baghdad Battery, you realize the ancient Parthians, or whoever actually threw this design together, some historians argue it was Assassinids, but the archaeological record is kind of a mess on the exact dates. They understood that power is just a natural reaction. It is just organized decay. Now, I know exactly what you're probably thinking right now. You're sitting there thinking, Paul, if this ancient clay pot trick works so well, why isn't it powering my refrigerator right now? Why did they bury it in the sand for 2 millennia instead of building an empire with it? Well, that's where the physics gets a little unforgiving and where the modern industry built its protective moat around the technology. See, the clay pot generates voltage, which is the electrical pressure, but it struggles massively to produce amperage, which is the actual flow, the heavy volume of the current.
The internal resistance of a rough clay jar filled with vinegar is huge. It's like trying to drink a thick frozen milkshake through a tiny plastic coffee stirrer. The suction pressure is there, but nothing is actually making it to your mouth. Modern batteries use highly engineered chemical pastes and ultra-thin synthetic separators to drop that internal resistance to almost nothing, so the power just floods out. But that exact limitation is the loophole we're exploiting today. Because once you understand exactly why the clay pot fails to deliver high amps, you understand exactly how to manipulate the chemistry yourself without needing their expensive synthetic pastes or a factory assembly line. You just need to change the surface area and the density of the electrolyte. When I first tried this in my garage a few years ago, I just threw a spool of copper wire and a rusty bolt into a mason jar of lemon juice, and honestly, I failed miserably. I barely got a reading on my digital multimeter, maybe 0.2 volts on a good day. It was incredibly frustrating. I actually thought the whole ancient battery thing was a complete myth, just a historical hallucination pushed by internet forums. But then I realized I was completely ignoring the physical scale of the oxidation. The secret isn't just throwing two metals in a jar, it is exactly how you bridge them. And there is a very specific, slightly dangerous reason why this modified high-yield method isn't printed in modern high school science textbooks, and it has everything to do with what happens when you scale this chemical reaction up inside an enclosed, sealed space. Because if you do exactly what I'm about to show you next, but you use the wrong type of container, well, the pressure doesn't just push electrons through a wire, it pushes hydrogen gas. And that is a violent mistake you will only ever make once. So here's the actual step-by-step of how you replicate this without blowing a hole in your workbench, or more likely just staring at a dead multimeter. The first thing you'll notice when you actually try to build a high-output version of the Baghdad cell is the friction of the materials. If you use a standard plastic Tupperware or a glass mason jar, you're already deviating from the thermal properties of the original terracotta. That unglazed clay wasn't just a container, it was a breathable membrane. Modern plastic traps every single byproduct of the reaction, and that's where the danger starts. As the acid eats the iron, it releases hydrogen gas. You can actually hear it, a faint rhythmic fizzing, almost like a freshly poured soda, but it smells like a wet penny. If you seal that up in a cheap container to protect the reaction, you're not making a battery, you're making a pressure vessel. That's why the first thing you absolutely need, and I'm telling you this because I ruined 3 digital meters before I figured out the current spikes, is a high-precision, low-resistance shunt. You cannot just twist some copper wires together and hope for the best. The connection point where the iron meets your lead wire is where 90% of people fail. It develops a layer of scale or oxidation almost instantly, which acts like a brick wall for the electricity. I found that using a specific type of conductive carbon grease or a high-quality alligator clip with a serrated bite is the only way to keep the flow consistent. Without a solid, biting connection, your free power stays trapped inside the jar as heat, and you'll watch the temperature of the liquid climb until it starts warping your container. Actually, let me clarify something. I used to think any old iron would work. I grabbed a handful of rusted garden sticks once and thought I was being clever. Total waste of time. Most modern iron is actually a complex alloy with chromium or nickel to prevent rust, which is exactly the opposite of what you want for a galvanic reaction. You need the metal to be vulnerable. You need it to sacrifice itself. That's why I started using pure iron filing rods, or even specific sacrificial anodes designed for water heaters. They're designed to corrode. And this is the part where you have to be careful. As that metal dissolves, the liquid turns a murky, swampy green color that is surprisingly hard to wash off your skin. It's a physical, messy process. It feels gritty. It's not clean like the electricity coming out of your wall. Now, to bridge the trust gap here, you have to realize that measuring this is not optional. If you can't see the voltage, you're just playing with jars of vinegar. You need a multimeter that can handle low burden voltage without sucking the life out of the cell just by probing it. Most cheap $5 meters from the bin at the hardware store have such high internal resistance that they'll give you a false reading. Or worse, they'll bridge the circuit and kill the reaction before it even peaks. You need a tool that can actually sense the micro fluctuations in the current so you know exactly when the acid is spent and needs a recharge of fresh juice. Wait, I should probably mention the asphalt plug. In the original Baghdad artifacts, they use bitumen, basically natural tar to seal the top. People think that was to hide the secret inside. Honestly, I think it was just to keep the smell down and stop the liquid from evaporating in the Iraqi heat. When you're doing this at home, you'll realize very quickly that an open jar of reacting acid will make your entire garage smell like a pickling factory within 20 minutes. But you can't seal it airtight. You have to leave a bleed hole for the gas. If you don't, you'll see the liquid start to bead up around the wires, pushed out by the internal pressure of the hydrogen. It's a constant balancing act between keeping the chemistry contained and letting the physics breathe. And that's the real reason you don't see this in a glossy manual. It requires you to actually pay attention to the physical state of the materials, something the modern plug-and-play energy industry has spent a century making sure you never have to do. One wrong move, one sealed cap, and the loophole becomes a mess you'll be scrubbing off the ceiling for a week. The reality is, the reason this loophole isn't sitting on a shelf at your local big box store isn't just because of some shadowy energy cabal. It's because the modern world is obsessed with convenience over competence. They want you to believe that power is something you buy, not something you understand. If you can build a functioning power cell with a clay pot and some old fruit juice, you suddenly realize that the entire $400 billion battery industry is built on a very simple, very old trick that they've just refined and wrapped in plastic. Actually, let me rephrase that. They haven't just refined it, they've obscured it. They've made it so clean and sealed that the average person feels completely helpless when the lights flicker. But when you're standing over a jar, smelling that sharp ozone and vinegar tang, and watching a digital meter jump to life from nothing but scrap metal and acid, that helplessness disappears. It's a permanent fix for the mindset of dependency. The suppression isn't always a buried patent. Sometimes it's just a shift in marketing that makes the old way seem like a primitive myth. We've been told for 100 years that ancient people were primitive, yet they were playing with the fundamental blocks of the universe while we were still trying to figure out how to keep the rain off our heads. There's a lingering sense of FOMO here for anyone who hasn't tried this yet, a feeling that you've been overpaying for a basic chemical reaction your entire life. Once you see that needle move on your multimeter, you can't unsee it. You'll never look at a pack of $20 AA batteries the same way again. You'll see them for what they are: overpriced disposable containers for a reaction you can trigger in your kitchen for pennies. The Goliath in this story only wins as long as you stay intimidated by the science. But the second you pick up a piece of copper and a sacrificial anode, you've stepped outside the grid. You've taken back a piece of knowledge that was literally buried in the sand for 2,000 years. And that, more than the free voltage, is the real power they didn't want you to find. Stay curious, stay skeptical, and stop letting them charge you for what the earth gives away for free. Paul Chang, out.